Hello, I'm Professor Jeffery Long, and thank you very much for joining us today. Our topic is Discovering Indian Philosophy, an introduction to Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist thought. This is such a vast topic covering literally thousands of years of in-depth thought on the part of great philosophers from a variety of different schools and systems, that what we're going to do today is really a very broad overview. We're going to get a sense of the landscape, you could say, of Indian philosophy. I have just written a book on this topic. You can see the cover here, Discovering Indian Philosophy. And I invite you, if you're interested in going into greater depth on these topics, please do have a look at my book. And of course, there are other books as well. Much has been written about Indian philosophy. But for those of you who may be new to this topic, or maybe not new, but would like a refresher, I'm hoping this will be a very useful overview of the major systems of Indian philosophy. So, moving into the presentation, I want to say a little bit first about what precisely we're talking about today, defining our field. So when we talk about Indian philosophy, I first want to look at this word Indian. What do we mean exactly by that? India here is certainly not limited to the boundaries of the contemporary Republic of India, which came into being back in 1947 when India became free from British rule. It refers in this presentation to the entire region, which was traditionally given this name by the Greeks. People in the West referred to this entire area as India for many centuries, named after the Indus River. In this region, of course, it was actually called the Sindhu River, but this was pronounced Indus by the Greeks, and they called the land beyond the Indus India. To people in India, it was called many other things. It was called Bharata or Bharatavarsha or Aryabhata, the variety of names by which it was known. But it's become conventional to speak of India as in this broader sense as referring to the entire region. And when we're talking about the contemporary world, we'll often use the term South Asia because, of course, there is now a specific country, India, and other countries, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, which are part of the entire region. But most of what we're looking back at goes to a much earlier period than those borders and those terms. So we're just using India in this very broad cultural sense to refer to the entire region. Indian philosophy. Though there are some schools of Indian philosophy that were originally intended to be restricted to a limited number of people, those who were regarded as possessing the adhikara, that is, the authority to have access to this very special knowledge, Indian philosophy as a whole is addressed to universal human concerns. Indian philosophy should not be seen simply as a cultural curiosity with only local or historical relevance, but as philosophy. Right? In the same way that this word philosophy that we now use globally in the world really has its origins in Greek thought and Greek philosophy, it's been taken as a discourse that has a universal relevance. And that's just as true of Indian philosophy as it is of Greek philosophy or German philosophy or Chinese philosophy, any other philosophy you might want to name. So it is Indian in the sense that it comes from this specific context and this specific culture and conversation. And in order to understand it, we need to understand that, right? We need to understand the Indianness of it. But we shouldn't see that as limiting it, as being only relevant to India or people from India. And we certainly shouldn't see it as simply something from the past, because most of these are living traditions that we're going to be talking about today. This conversation is still unfolding. Indeed, many Indian philosophical schools of thought have a global following today. Buddhism has long had adherents across Asia, and in the modern period, systems like Vedanta, yoga, Jainism, and other systems have been carried abroad by Indian immigrants, Indian teachers, and taken up by interested non-Indians. So really, this is a global collection of schools of thought that have their anchoring and their historical origin in India. So delving more into what we mean by philosophy, philosophy here is referring to what you might broadly call a worldview, a way of looking at reality. The term for this in Sanskrit, the language in which much of Indian philosophy has been carried out, is darshana. The word philosophy, of course, is derived from the ancient Greek philosophia, that is the love of wisdom. A number of Sanskrit terms can be translated as philosophy. There is jignasa, that is inquiry, literally a desire for knowledge. So not unlike the love of wisdom idea in philosophia. There's anvikshiki. This is a term we also see in Indian texts. Analysis, it refers to applying logic to a problem. One thinks here of the American philosopher William James's definition of philosophy as a stubborn effort to think clearly. And anvikshiki is like that. It's bringing logic to play in what might be a very complex situation or problem. And there's also logic itself, tarka, as it's called in Indian philosophy. But philosophy is not only logic, right? It deploys logic, but it also has other aspects and other dimensions that we want to look at. So the Sanskrit term most frequently taken as synonymous with philosophy is darshana, which literally means a view or a worldview. Some of you might have heard this term before. Darshana, or darshan, as it's called in modern languages such as Hindi, can refer to the practice of going to a temple or a sacred place and seeing the image of a deity or of a sacred figure, and also being seen by that sacred figure. And it's believed there's a very special and sacred exchange that happens in this process of darshan. The root word here goes back to the idea of sight. So you have this popular idea of darshan, something that one practices in a temple, people talking about going for darshan to a special temple. It's a way to get a blessing and feel a special connection with the deity. But in terms of sight, it also means view, perspective, how one looks at something. And so the various systems of Indian philosophy are known as the darshanas, and the practice of philosophy is also darshana, seeing, from darshanam, which is a Sanskrit word meaning seeing. So when we speak of Indian philosophical systems or schools of thought, you'll hear me use this terminology a lot today. We are referring to the darshanas, the traditions defined by particular perspectives on reality, the arguments presented for these perspectives, and the texts in which these perspectives are put forward. All of that is darshana. It should be noted that although individual Indian philosophers tend to be affiliated to a particular darshana, it should not be assumed that these thinkers simply parroted the views of their schools of thought. There's a danger in the way many of us tend to present Indian philosophy, because sometimes you will see, and you'll see this again today, more or less a list of schools of thought and views attributed to them. And what this covers up is the thousands of years of conversation and argumentation and really very sophisticated thought that has gone into developing and defending these views. So we want to bear in mind that in the background, behind these schools of thought that I'm describing are very creative thinkers. Indian thinkers have shown great creativity in developing their arguments and their positions. Some have also written texts commenting upon the teachings of multiple darshanas. So they'll be affiliated with a particular school, but that doesn't confine them to talking only about their school in an authoritative way. So, for example, there have been great scholars, Vachaspati Mishra, for example, he commented upon Vedanta texts, but he also commented upon yoga texts. Yashovijaya was a Jain thinker, but he delved very deeply into the Nyaya school. So, one was not confined by affiliating to a particular darshana. The way Indian philosophy proceeds, textually speaking, is most Indian philosophy is written in the form of commentary. You'll have a root text of a particular school of thought, a darshana, and then it is elaborated and commented upon by another thinker. Now, again, this can create the illusion that they're simply repeating what was said before. But these commentaries, again, show great creativity, and there is sometimes disagreement between commentators about what a particular text means. And that whole conversation is really what makes up Indian philosophy. Now, I'm talking in terms of texts. If we look at the way the schools actually proceeded in practice for much of history, a lot of this debate would happen in person, and there would be conversations within a school of thought, and of course, there would be debates across various schools as well. So darshana is an excellent equivalent for philosophia, for philosophy, if we are attentive to the original sense of this term in its ancient Greek context. As author Pierre Hadot has beautifully explained in his book Philosophy as a Way of Life, philosophy in its origins was not the abstract exercise of current academic philosophers. It was rather embedded in a way of life aimed at some ideal of the good. So the abstract side of philosophy, the purely intellectual side of philosophy, has always been there, but it's divorced from how we live our day-to-day lives. It's becoming a purely academic exercise, is a more or less modern development. What happened over time in the history of the West is that the way of life aspect came more and more to be the domain of religion. And so there was a sundering eventually of what we think of as religion and philosophy. This did not happen traditionally in India. The way of life and the way of thinking were seen as helping one another, as fueling one another. So there are a lot of affinities between Indian philosophy and philosophy as it originated in the Western world. Here's a nice quote from Professor Hadot. He says, philosophy, reduced as we have seen to philosophical discourse, develops from this point on in a different atmosphere and environment from that of ancient philosophy. In modern university philosophy, philosophy is obviously no longer a way of life or a form of life, unless it be the form of life of a professor of philosophy, which is a nice observation on his part. This brings us to the question of the relationship of Indian philosophy and spirituality, which are often seen as synonymous. But we want to also sound a cautionary note in that regard. Because of its embeddedness in a way of life aimed at a vision of the ultimate good, in the case of most darshanas, the goal of transcending and becoming liberated from the cycle of karma and rebirth, Indian philosophy has at times been conflated with religion, mysticism, or spirituality. Now, while there are certainly dimensions of many darshanas, I would say most of the darshanas that are what we might call religious, mystical, or spiritual in character, scholars of Indian philosophy, especially over the last 30 years or so, have quite rightly objected to these characterizations because they suggest that Indian philosophers have not examined the whole range of human interests. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Indian philosophers have explored topics ranging from the nature of knowledge to the composition of the material world, the character of logical argumentation, and this worldly topics like economics and statecraft. All of these things have been explored, the whole range of topics, aesthetics. If you think of everything that's been explored in Western philosophy, it's also been explored in Indian philosophy. But it has not been delinked from the way of life, the spiritual path, and this is, again, why it sometimes gets conflated with that. Many scholars have also argued that this characterization has kind of an air of colonialism about it, right? That it is suggesting that, well, the Indians are very mystical, and therefore they were not rational, and they need Western rationality to fix their problems, and so on. And this is all just a rationalization for the British imperialism back in the 18th and 19th centuries. But this way of thinking often continues. Indian philosophy also has a deeply skeptical character, as no question is left unanswered and no topic is forbidden. Logical defenses must be given for claims that are made, and Indian philosophers do not simply fall back upon feelings or intuitions in making their assertions, right? If by mystical someone means, well, I believe this because I feel it's true, an Indian philosopher would not accept that, right? That does not pass muster. This is not to say that intuition, scriptural authority, and even phenomena such as yogic perception and past life memory cannot be drawn upon. We find those things in Indian philosophy, but they have to be established on an agreed upon basis in order to be regarded as persuasive. And in fact, there's one very important principle of Indian philosophy I'd like to mention at this point. Every school of thought has its own what are called pramanas. We're going to talk more about pramanas later, but a pramana is our basis for making a judgment. It can be sensory perception. I judge that the light in my room is on because I can see it, right? This is a very simple pramana. It can also be more complex, like an inference from other data based on a wider application of a rule or principle. And there are quite a few others as well. And in Indian philosophy, if you're arguing with someone from a different school of thought, a different darshana, you can only use pramanas that the other person accepts. Otherwise, your argument is not going to be valid to them. So an example that might be familiar from the Western world, if someone is arguing from the authority of the Bible, that something is true. Well, look here, it's in the Bible. If you say that to someone who doesn't believe the Bible is an authority, that argument is not going to be helpful at all. But if you're arguing with someone who does believe the Bible is true, then saying, well, look, it's in the Bible is a valid move. So in the same way, we see there are internal discussions within the darshanas, and there are discussions across the darshanas rooted in more common canons of reason and observation. Now let's look at the darshanas themselves. I've been discussing the general character of Indian philosophy, but let's talk about some of the actual traditions. And what I've done in my book is try to present these in a more or less historical, chronological fashion. But on the next slide, I want to give you, this is more ahistorical. It's more of just a chart of the various schools of Indian philosophy. And so this is a taxonomy, a way of dividing the Indian systems of philosophy. There are two main divisions. There are what are sometimes called the Vaidika, that is Vedic systems of philosophy. These are also called Astika or Orthodox, but we need to sound a note of caution here because these systems are only Orthodox from a Vedic perspective, what we would now call a Hindu perspective. And the other systems that are generally regarded as Gnostica or heterodox, they're only Gnostica from a Vedic point of view. They do not see themselves as Gnostica, right? But this is a terminology that's been handed down by authors, most of whom were in a Vedic tradition. So another way to say this is that the systems of philosophy on the left are all part of what we would today call Hindu philosophy. The term was not there for most of history, Hindu, but Vaidika was there, Vedic. They look back to the Vedas as authoritative texts. And then you have texts which do not look to the Vedas as authoritative texts. And that's a division that would be accepted to all the schools of thought. So on the Vedic side, we have three pairs of schools of thought. There are Sankhya and Yoga, Nyaya and Vaisheshika, and Mimamsa and Vedanta, which are sometimes called Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. And they are paired in this way because each of the members of these pairs share certain basic affinities. So Sankhya and Yoga, for example, share a lot of their basic worldview and terminology. The relationship between Sankhya and Yoga could maybe be characterized as the relationship of theory to practice. You get the theory, the philosophical worldview set up in Sankhya, and then on that basis, Yoga develops a system of practice that leads to the realization of the same goal that Sankhya has articulated. This term yoga, by the way, will be of interest, I think, to a lot of people because most persons associate yoga with what are called asanas, that is postures, positions one sits in or stretches into. And this physical aspect of yoga is not unrelated to the school of philosophy, but the asanas were not the major preoccupation of the yoga school. The main preoccupation is the transformation of consciousness. And that's what most of these systems are about on some level. With Nyaya, you get a system of logical analysis. And then with Vaisheshika, you get the application of analysis to the material world. So Vaisheshika is something like a science. It talks about the various substances that make up our phenomenal experiences. And then with the Mimamsa and Vedanta schools, the Purva Mimamsa, the earlier Mimamsa, the Uttara Mimamsa, later Mimamsa. Mimamsa means interpretation or exegesis. Both of these systems are focused on interpreting the Veda, the Vedic text, the Vedic literature. Purva Mimamsa, or just plain Mimamsa, is associated with the earlier, the prior portion of the Veda, and then Vedanta, the later Mimamsa, with the later portion of the Veda called the Upanishads. We're going to talk about all of this in a little bit more detail later. Among the non-Vedic schools, you get Jain philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, a system called the Ajivika system of thought, which is now extinct. There are no longer practitioners of Ajivika today. But the other systems, there are still people who adhere to these. You get the Charvaka or Lokayata, that is the materialist school of thought. And then finally, at the bottom, I've listed Tantra, which is a system of philosophy that really kind of overlaps these two categories. You have Hindu forms of Tantra, you have Buddhist forms of Tantra. Tantra is a philosophy, but it's also very much a practice. And it is centered on experiencing the ultimate reality that one is seeking to experience and perceive within the sensory world itself. Whereas many of the other systems, such as yoga, are focused on setting aside the sensory world and focusing in a purely inward way. According to Tantra, you can achieve the same goal going outward and experiencing the senses. So these are the main forms of Indian philosophy. And I'm going to go over some of the basics of them, but again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in quite the depth it deserves. We're really just going to get a very quick overview of these traditions. But again, I would like to invite you to explore further. I'm hoping this video will be an invitation to go into greater depth into these various schools of thought. And besides my book, I mean, there are many resources for the investigation of these systems. So if we proceed chronologically, if we look at the history of India, the first thing we run into is actually the prehistory, you could say, of India, is the civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization. It's highly likely that the roots of Indian philosophy can be traced to this earliest civilization in the Indian subcontinent, variously called the Indus Valley, Harappan, or Indus Saraswati civilization. There's some evidence that they called themselves the Meluhan civilization, but we don't know this for sure. These are various names by which scholars know it. It's mostly known as the Indus Valley civilization. It was at its peak back in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. So the 2000s BC, long time ago, very sophisticated, very advanced. Whatever later traditions may have drawn precisely from the culture of the civilization remains unknown unless its system of writing is deciphered. We still don't know how to read the writing. There has been some writing left behind by the Indus people. Scholars are working on cracking the code, but it has not yet been unambiguously cracked. It's not readable yet, the way, say, Egyptian hieroglyphics or cuneiform writing, both of which would be contemporary with this period. It's not readable in the ways those are readable today. So that's a puzzle yet to be solved. Why am I mentioning it at all? Well, because it was such an advanced and such a widespread civilization that it cannot but have had an influence on everything else we're going to talk about. And the systems of thought that we're looking at are so sophisticated in so many ways, it suggests that there's already been many centuries of development behind them, even before we get the texts that we can read in Sanskrit and use to understand these philosophies. The first readable text we have from India is the collection known as the Vedas. This is our first known source, that is, source that we have access to today for ancient Indian philosophical reflection. So these are collectively known as the Vedas. Veda means wisdom. They were compiled over the course of many centuries. Much of the history of early Indian philosophical thought can be traced through these texts. You see philosophical unpacking occurring from the earliest Vedic texts to the later Vedic texts, which are the Upanishads. So you see a movement through these texts from ritual to philosophy. The earliest Vedic texts consist of hymns. This is a collection called the Rig Veda. The probably the oldest religious text in the world that's part of a tradition that's still alive and still practiced today. It has descriptions of rituals in which the hymns would be chanted. That's a portion called the Yajurveda. There's a system of intonation for chanting the hymns, the Samaveda. A lot of Indian classical music can trace some of its roots back to the Samaveda. And then finally, a fourth Veda, which describes simpler rituals and also contains some early philosophical reflections. This is a text called the Atharva Veda. Reflection on the Vedic ritual texts led to the development of gradually more philosophical writings, presented as commentaries and explanations of the principles behind the Vedic rituals. So, in other words, you start with the ritual. You start with this performance that's done by priests invoking divine beings and aimed at upholding the world and also bringing about specific goals that people want to achieve. Long life, a good afterlife, for kings, success in ruling their kingdom, and so on. The successive collections of commentaries, the portions that come after, that are traditionally studied after the ritual portions, gradually go into deeper and deeper philosophical explanation of that ritual worldview that we see in the earliest texts. So you get the Brahmanas, the priestly texts, the Aranyakas, the forest texts, and then finally the Upanishads, the sacred secret teaching. To give an example of what I'm talking about, there are many, many more such examples. But if you look at this picture here, this is a much, much later artistic rendering of the cosmic man. In the Rig Veda, there is a hymn called the Purusha Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic man. In this hymn, the entire cosmos is described as having come from the body of this vast being, the Purusha, offered in a sacrificial ritual. He offers himself and his body becomes the universe. The various parts of this being become the various parts of the cosmos. As this idea is presented and reflected on further in the middle and later Vedic texts, culminating in the Upanishads, it comes to be presented as the idea that the entire cosmos is the manifestation of a single infinite consciousness. Right? So the self-sacrifice of the Purusha, a very ritualistic image, comes to be seen as an image for the manifestation of consciousness, a more abstract ideal. In later systems of Indian philosophy, one sees this same idea reflected in different ways as these very sophisticated systems developed. So there's the teaching of the Advaita Vedanta school that the cosmos is a mere appearance or maya of the infinite Brahman. In Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, one sees the original ideal preserved, that the cosmos is in fact the body of God, Ishvara, and that God is the world soul, the soul of the universe, the Jagat, the flow of existence. In some forms of Mahayana Buddhism, even though this is a non-Vedic school of thought, still you get a related idea that the apparent reality which living beings experience is a manifestation of a singular cosmic mind, the cosmic Buddha, personified as the Buddha Mahavairocana, the Buddha who is projecting all of existence out like rays of light from the sun. And this is depicted in Buddhist art all the way to Japan. So going back to the Upanishads do not present systematic philosophy of the kind found in later Indian schools of thought. If you read them, they're much more poetic. They're records of conversations between teachers and students of the Vedas, trying to discern the deep inner meaning of the Vedic texts. Among the many ideas these texts cover, there are the concepts of Brahman, an infinite consciousness presented as the foundation of all that exists, and Atman, or self, which is affirmed to be either identical or akin to Brahman. Now, is it identical or is it akin? Those are two different ideas. And some portions of the Upanishads can be read one way, some can be read another, some can be read both ways, depending on how you read the text. And later schools of thought picked up one or the other of these interpretations and ran with them. So we have Advaita Vedanta saying Brahman is Atman, they are one. And you have Vishishtadvaita, Dvaita, other systems saying, well, the self is like Brahman. It has the spiritual nature of Brahman, but is distinct. So this is one of the topics that becomes a major point of debate and differentiation of schools of later Indian thought. The realization of this identity or kinship of self and Brahman is taught to lead to liberation from the cycle of karma and rebirth, which is also described for the first time in some detail in these texts. Again, when we're talking about identity of self and Brahman, we're talking about a kind of realization. This is what I already was and did not know it or had forgotten it. We're talking of kinship. We're talking about a relationship of devotion, and a kind of loving union between the self and the infinite. And again, these reflect different practices, different systems that all go back to these same core texts. At the same time as the Upanishads were being composed, there was a movement of ascetics. Now, the composers of the Upanishads were also ascetics. I mean, people who withdraw from conventional society and focus upon spiritual practices aimed at transforming their mind, transforming their consciousness. The ascetics of the Upanishads were affiliated to the Vedic schools and affirmed the authority of the Veda. But there was another group of ascetics who did not. They were called the strivers, that is, the Shramanas. Strivers, those who put forth great effort. So contemporary with the era of the Upanishads, these other systems of thought emerge that aren't affiliated with the Vedic tradition. They're part of this striver movement. There is Jainism, there is the Ajivika tradition, which I mentioned earlier, and there is Buddhism. Starting with the Jain tradition, which probably is the oldest of these, we have the figure of Mahavira. He lived in the 6th century BC, and he's regarded in the Jain tradition as in fact, not the founder of the tradition, but actually the 24th in a series of 24 enlightened teachers who've appeared in this world in our current cosmic cycle. These beings come, they attain enlightenment, and they show a way to other beings who can also then attain enlightenment, attain freedom from karma and rebirth. Jain philosophy emphasizes a strict practice of ahimsa, that is nonviolence in thought, word, and action, in order to purify the soul, the jiva, the life force of karmic impurities, which bind it to the cycle of rebirth. Karma, I haven't really defined yet, but I've used the word several times. It's practically become an English word, but you have the idea of cause and effect, that whatever we do has an effect on us at some point in the future. The Jain tradition presents karma as an actual substance, or maybe you could call it an energy that is bound to the soul, and that the soul has to work through and experience. And there's a path to purify the soul of these karmas and thereby become free from the cycle of rebirth. As it developed through the centuries, this tradition also came to be noted for its teaching of anekantavada, that is, the teaching of the complexity of existence. This results in multiple perspectives from which any topic can be viewed, and a philosophy that emphasizes the presence of truth in many views. In modern day teaching, many modern Jain teachers will tell you that this is an intellectual expression of ahimsa, that just as we don't do physical harm or wish any harm or say anything rude or unkind to other beings when we're on the path to liberation, in the same way we should not harshly criticize the views of others. What they hold dear, what they hold sacred, we may not agree with completely, but everyone's part of the same reality, and we're therefore all connecting back in some fashion in our views to that original reality. This is often represented with the famous Indian story of the blind people and the elephant. And we see a picture of that here, where you have a group of people feeling different parts of the elephant. According to the story, they begin to debate amongst themselves about the nature of the elephant because they've all felt a different part of it. And then eventually they realize they're talking about the same animal. It just has different parts, right? It's complex. It contains all of the aspects that each person has perceived. In the same way, reality has many facets and aspects, and each system of philosophy can be seen as a view, a darshan, right, of that aspect of reality. There's the Ajivika tradition, which is not well known today. In fact, it died out at a certain point in terms of practice. But at one point, it was very popular. The founder of the tradition, Makali Gosala, was a contemporary of Mahavira and the Buddha. He's mentioned in both Buddhist and Jain writings. The Ajivikas are held to have taught that attaining liberation from rebirth is a matter of destiny. It will happen to all beings inevitably. And this is presented in Buddhist and Jain texts as a very dangerous idea, because if it's going to happen eventually anyway, why practice renunciation? Why practice asceticism? Why follow the moral code and so on? In fact, these are such good questions that a contemporary Indologist, scholar of Indian philosophy, Johannes Bronkhorst, has challenged this characterization. He has reconstructed the teaching of the Ajivikas. We don't have Ajivika texts, unfortunately, of any great length that we can use to deduce their views. But they did practice strict asceticism, much like the Jains. So Bronkhorst argues that it's more likely that they taught that one can do nothing about the karmas one has already accumulated, but one can avoid future karmas. This differentiates the Ajivikas from the Jains, who argue that you can, through ascetic practice, avoid future karmas and also get rid of the karmas that you already have. You can accelerate the process. Apparently, Makali Gosala said, no, you can't accelerate that. That process is going to take the time it's going to take. But you can avoid taking on further karma through an ascetic life. This tradition had a large following during the time of Mahavira and the Buddha, according to the texts of both the Jain and Buddhist traditions. But by the 10th century of the Common Era, it was extinct. And there's a tradition which states that the few remaining Ajivika monks actually became Jain monks around that time. Shifting to Buddhism, much better known in the contemporary world, it went on and became a major world tradition. It was the first school of Indian philosophy to really be carried far and wide beyond India. Siddhartha Gautama, or Shakyamuni, as he's also called, the Buddha, lived roughly contemporarily with Mahavira. A little later, he lived in the late 6th, early 5th century. And he drew from the variety of teachings available in his time as part of his personal quest for enlightenment and freedom from the suffering associated with the cycle of rebirth. It's said that around the age of 29 or 30, he undertook the ascetic quest. He went and became a wandering mendicant, much like Mahavira and others. He studied with various teachers and learned techniques of meditation, learned techniques of self-restraint, much of which we can see in other traditions like Jainism, like yoga, like the traditions of the Upanishads. And he developed his own unique synthesis of these practices and ideas. Famously, his teaching is summarized as the Four Noble Truths. Worldly life inevitably involves suffering. This is something pretty much all of the Shramana traditions and the authors of the Upanishads would agree with. Suffering is due to our attachment to external objects and conditions. So, we expect happiness to come from the things we're attached to, but that happiness is at best impermanent and sometimes causes us actual pain. There is a state, though, of freedom from suffering. It's a common misconception that Buddhism is pessimistic. It's pessimistic if you stop at the first noble truth. But the point is that there is a way out of this. And the way to that state of freedom is something called the Eightfold Path, made up of right understanding, right motive, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. So, the Buddhist path. The Buddha taught the radical impermanence of all phenomena, what we conventionally think of as the self. Even that, even our own self, is really a series of discrete, causally connected moments through time. Why is this doctrine of no self important? Well, it's the self that desires, it's the self that is attached. And if we realize that even this self is a kind of mental construct, based on the phenomena that are being experienced, this will loosen that attachment that we have to physical experience, external conditions, emotional states, and so on. This conversation internally to Buddhism continued to unfold and developed some of the most sophisticated philosophies coming out of India. Around the start of the Common Era, there emerged texts known as the Mahayana or Prajna Paramita, that is perfection of wisdom texts. These sutras, these texts, take this idea even further and apply the idea of shunyata, that is emptiness, not having a self or essence, to phenomena as we experience them in the world. The phenomena are insubstantial. This is the idea. This idea was defended philosophically by the Buddhist scholar Nagarjuna, pictured here, who lived around the 3rd, maybe 2nd into the 3rd century of the Common Era. And his system of thought was called Madhyamika, the middle way, because it tried to avoid becoming attached to extremes. When you think about philosophy, someone puts forth a proposition. It's this way. Well, then that invites its opposite, right? Its antithesis. No, it's not that way. And then you have philosophical schools of thought arguing. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. If you remember the old Monty Python argument sketch where people are yelling at each other, yes, it is, no, it isn't, it gives you an idea of, it's kind of a caricature of philosophical debate. And Nagarjuna's approach is to say, to reject both the yes and the no, right? To not take an extreme position, to realize that truth is ultimately beyond words, that words and concepts themselves are empty. And even his own philosophy that he put forward, he essentially said, this is not a philosophy, right? This is the antidote to philosophy, as it were. That was one approach. Then you get the 5th century Mahayana Buddhist philosopher, Vasubandhu. He applied the idea of shunyata to the relationship between subject and object, that is, the experiencer and the thing experienced, affirming that what we experience is really a field of appearances. The reality is actually consciousness, vijnana, and his school of thought is sometimes called Vijnanavada, the teaching of consciousness, or chittamatra, mind only. And it's sometimes equated, it's not a perfect equation, but it is in some ways akin to what's called idealism in Western philosophy. Basically, the idea that what we think of as the physical world isn't really a physical world. It's a set of appearances in the mind which we're experiencing. And you can see, again, that this is a way of uprooting attachment. And one of the main concerns of thinkers in this school was practice, right? The philosophy is never to be completely divorced from the way of life. Remember what Haddo said. So this school is also called Yogacara for that reason, the practice of yoga. Yoga here meaning spiritual discipline. Ideas like those of Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu would later have a profound impact on the Chan or Zen tradition of China and Japan, tradition which also spread to Korea, to Vietnam, and is now global. Chan or Zen draws on many of these same ideas, that what we're trying to do is wake up from delusional thinking. And that delusional thinking involves belief in persons, objects, even ourselves. That truth is beyond what such concepts can encompass. So if we pull back from Buddhism, if we look at the shamanic philosophies, Jainism, the Ajivikas, and the Buddhists, they have certain common characteristics. They affirm the reality of karma, the cycle of rebirth, and the goal of freedom from the cycle of rebirth. They share this with the teaching of the Upanishads and the later Vedic schools, for the most part. They do not posit a creator deity or a singular supreme being presiding over the cosmic process. This differentiates them from most of the Vedic schools, which tend to be theistic in that sense. But not all, but for the most part. Finally, the shamanic philosophers do not regard the Vedas as authoritative guides to conduct or the nature of reality. They sometimes have quite critical things to say about these texts. So even though they share certain ideas that are also part of Vedic philosophy, like karma and rebirth, they don't look to the Vedas as foundational. They look to the teaching of enlightened beings. For the Jains, that would be the Jinnas, beings like Mahavira. For the Buddhists, that would be Buddhas, beings like Shakyamuni and other great Buddhas who are believed to have existed through history. There's another school of thought here, which sort of rejects everything we've just been talking about. The materialist school, that is the Charvaka or Lokayata school. Interestingly, it's attributed to a Vedic deity, Brihaspati, who's pictured here. He is said to have taught this doctrine. This will be familiar to many people because it's quite close to what a lot of folks in the modern world believe. This school of thought rejects ideas like karma, rebirth, liberation, the efficacy of Vedic ritual, a creator deity, pretty much anything that you cannot perceive with the senses. They say that's not real. It affirms that all knowledge comes from sensory perception. So this idea that all knowledge comes from sensory perception, this was a concept that was really targeted by all the other schools of thought, the other darshanas, when they debated with the Lokayatas, because certainly all the schools affirm the efficacy of sensory perception. That's the one pramana that's shared and agreed upon by everyone. But if we say that we only know what comes through the senses, one implication of that is that we can only know what's happening right now at this moment. The modern philosopher George Santayana called this the solipsism of the present moment, because is memory a reliable guide? Now, perhaps there were Lokayatas that took up this question. Maybe they could argue that memory is a result of the imprints of past sensory impressions, something of that sort. But the idea that the senses alone are the one valid pramana was seen as a weakness by the other schools of thought. Another interesting thing is that while something like this is very widespread in the modern world, this school of thought was not the predominant one in ancient times in India, though the word lokayata, loka means world, it can also mean society, is sometimes taken to suggest that this is what kind of ordinary people thought, right? That if you weren't a philosopher, you were probably skeptical about a lot of the things the philosophers were talking about. So it could have been very widespread, but it wasn't widespread amongst intellectuals, amongst the people who wrote texts and left texts behind. We have very little text left by the Lokayatas. But of course, that could also be a function of the fact that the other schools sort of won the argument. Subsequent development of Vedic thought, right? So everything I've been talking about developed in the basically middle of the first millennium of the Common Era and then into the first millennium of the Common Era. So simultaneously with the development of the Jain, Buddhist, and Ajivika and Lokayata schools of thought, from the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era and into the first millennium of the Common Era, these systems of philosophy, the Vedic systems, eventually making up what we now call Hinduism, these also were developing at the same time. So I want to turn to that conversation now. This was the era of the development of the 6 orthodox Vedic systems that I mentioned earlier, as well as the generation of an extensive literature, including 2 major epic poems, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, stories of the deeds of the major Hindu deities, these stories called the Puranas, Hindu literature on right behavior, that is Dharma Shastra, and statecraft, Artha Shastra, as well as a host of other topics, architecture, drama, all of these things had shastras or sutras written about them. Grammar, the whole range of human sciences was there. And I don't have time to speak much today about the philosophy in all of that literature, but it's very, very rich. And the part of it that is probably had the biggest impact, at least in the modern world, is a section of the Mahabharata called the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Divine One. And that becomes an important root text of the Vedanta traditions, as we will see. So looking at these different, remember the 3 pairs that I mentioned earlier? We're going to just kind of give a little bit more depth on them right now. Sankhya and Yoga. The Sankhya and Yoga systems affirm the duality, that is the difference of Purusha, which means spirit in this context, and material nature, or Prakriti. Purusha has mistaken itself for Prakriti. The pure consciousness thinks it's a body, and it identifies with the experiences in the material world, and thus becomes bound to the cycle of rebirth. The goal is for Purusha to realize its independence from Prakriti. It's not so much that it becomes pure spirit, it has always been pure spirit that has forgotten that and is recollecting its true nature. Sankhya pursues this through an analysis of the elements making up phenomenal reality. That's what Sankhya means. It's a kind of enumeration of all the various elements. Yoga adds to this. It presupposes the Sankhya system and adds an 8-step system, the Ashtanga Yoga, 8-limbed yoga, many of you might have heard of, a system of mental restraint and meditative practice culminating in something called samadhi, meditative absorption. This is where you realize you are Purusha. And so yoga adds a practice to, you could say, the theory of reality that Sankhya presents. Then we come to the pairing of Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Nyaya and Vaisheshika, respectively, are systems of logic and cosmology aimed at articulating how knowledge can be attained and describing the nature of the material world. So Nyaya's focus is the pramanas, which I've mentioned before. A pramana is the basis for making a judgment that something is true. Perception, which is universally accepted, that is pratyaksha in Sanskrit. Inference or anumana, the authority of a knowledgeable person, that is shabda pramana, etc. And a lot of Indian philosophical debate involves or is about these pramanas, because if you're going to claim to know anything, the next question is, how do you know that? And so a pramana is an answer to that question. Well, we know this because, and there's some debate about which pramanas are acceptable. As I've already mentioned, the Lokayatas think that only perception is acceptable. All the other schools of thought accept perception, but also inference, right? You can, based on a perception, deduce something or infer something. Authority, this is a controversial one because, of course, the question is, which authority? Vedic systems will take the Vedas as authoritative texts proclaiming the true nature of reality. But if you're a Jain or a Buddhist, that won't work. But Jains and Buddhists do accept authority, but they accept the authority of an enlightened being. Well, which enlightened being? Well, Mahavira if you're a Jain, Buddha if you're a Buddhist. And so debate goes on amongst the schools of thought about how we know things and how pramanas work and so on. Vaisheshika is focused on the dravyas, that is the substances, some of which are atomic in nature. There's an atomic theory in ancient Indian philosophy. And there are also non-atomic substances like space, for example. These make up the world of our common experience. Then finally, we come to the third pair, Mimamsa and Vedanta. Mimamsa and Vedanta are the most obviously Vedic of the Vedic systems because they're focused on the Vedas specifically. The other systems accept Vedic authority, but they don't really go to the Vedas as a source of knowledge. They accept them as a source of knowledge, but the specialists in the Vedas as a source of knowledge are the Mimamsakas and the Vedantins. So they're focused on the interpretation and elucidation of the Vedic texts. Why the division? Well, they're focused on different portions of the Vedas. Remember I said there's the ritual portion, and then you get more philosophical. You have what's called the knowledge portion. So Mimamsa is focused on Vedic ritual injunctions. It's actually very philosophical, but its focus is on what you do. And they say the important teachings of the Vedas are the ones which tell you to do something, right? The system, it developed, the thinkers in the system develop a sophisticated form of linguistic philosophy to explain the workings of the Vedic verses in a ritual context. One of the beliefs in the Vedic ritual tradition is that the verses have efficacy if they're pronounced correctly, in the right way, and in the right time in a ritual. And all the Sanskrit grammars, in-depth study of linguistics and grammar in ancient India, at least a great deal of it came out of this tradition. Vedanta is focused on the Upanishads, that later literature, and this is seen, these texts are seen as the ultimate and authoritative guide to the nature of reality and the way to liberation. These systems also have their own root texts. There are Mimamsa Sutras, which outline the principles by which you should interpret the Vedas. There are Vedanta Sutras, also called the Brahma Sutras, which summarize the content of the Upanishads. You could say the Brahma Sutras are a summary of the Upanishads for philosophers, for specialists, Then the Bhagavad Gita, which I mentioned earlier, is also seen as a foundational text, and its intent is to describe the content of the Upanishads to ordinary people, right? The Bhagavad Gita is seen as a more easily graspable text. The Brahma Sutras are very, very technical in nature. There are systems of Vedanta, because, as I mentioned before, there are portions of the Upanishads that can be interpreted in divergent ways. I'm going to spend a little time just quickly going through the systems of Vedanta, because these have tended to become the predominant systems. If we look historically, all the other systems still exist, except for the Ajivikas. But if we look at Hindu practice, if we look at what is seen as authoritative philosophy and teaching for most Hindus today, there's an affiliation with one or another of the schools of Vedanta. And the debates amongst the schools of Vedanta come to predominate in the second millennium of the Common Era, right? The millennium which just ended for us a few years ago. We start with the Advaita Vedanta of Shankara, pictured here. This is based on an earlier system called Ajativada of Shankara's teacher's teacher, who was named Gaudapada. And in that teaching, Brahman, the infinite, alone is real. The whole cosmos is Maya, it is appearance, it is unreal. But not all followers of Vedanta agree with that system. So there is Vishishtadvaita. This is non-duality with difference, sometimes called qualified non-dualism, of Ramanuja. Ramanuja and all the other Vedantic thinkers I'm going to mention believe that religious devotion, bhakti, personal relationship with the Supreme Being, they believe that's undermined by Shankara's approach. And so they tried to develop philosophies. They developed philosophies which really could ground that experience. In Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, Brahman is the organic unity of God, Ishvara, the cosmos, the Jagat, and the innumerable souls, the jivas within it, all of us. So instead of saying Brahman alone is real, the world is an illusion, what Vishishtadvaita says, what Ramanuja says, is Brahman is the unity of God and the world and us, all of it together. The cosmos is, for Ramanuja, the body of God. Well, this calls to mind the Rig Veda, right, and the Purusha Sukta. So you see a continuity of thought all through here. There is the Dvaita, or dualistic Vedanta, of Madhva. Madhva thought that even Ramanuja did not go far enough, and developed a thoroughly dualistic way of thinking. The duality or difference between Ishvara, or God, and Ishvara's devotees is real and fundamental and essential to the liberating relationship of bhakti, or devotion. Bhakti is a relationship, and so for a relationship you need two. So duality is emphasized here instead of non-duality. But many systems of Vedanta seek to reconcile the ideas of duality and non-duality, because both are themes of the Upanishads. If you try to affirm only one and not the other, there are big parts of the Upanishads that you need to sort of say are symbolic or metaphorical, or or you just don't focus on them as much, right? So there are systems of Vedanta that try to bring it all together. Ramanuja's is one. You also have the Dvaita, that is duality and non-duality, of Nimbarka. Achintya Bheda Bheda Vedanta of Chaitanya. Bheda Bheda means something like dual and non-dual. And Achintya means inconceivable, right? It goes beyond what the mind can conceive. Chaitanya's thinking, interestingly, is the basis for prominent Vaishnava tradition, tradition of devotion to Vishnu, which is prominent in the U.S. today. If any of you have heard of the Hare Krishna movement, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, they are traced back to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, which Chaitanya established. There are other great Vedanta teachers as well. That alone could become the topic of an entire study. There's also modern Vedanta, and there are many, many exponents of this tradition. I'll just mention two, but there are many more. These two are particularly famous. In the modern period, Vedanta has again been interpreted in a way that emphasizes the diversity of possible paths to divine, that is, pluralism, and the importance of direct experience of the divine reality, that is, anubhava or vijnana. And these have been championed a lot by Sri Ramakrishna, pictured on the left. He was a Bengali sage who lived in the 19th century, and Swami Vivekananda, his most prominent disciple, who brought Vedanta and Hindu philosophy to the Western world. Very famously speaking at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 and establishing Vedanta societies. After him, there have been many, many more. And in fact, I've written a book on Hinduism in America, which you can consult and see about many of these teachers that came after Vivekananda. But Vedanta is a very, very big stream, really the dominant stream of Hindu thought today. Though, again, the others still exist and are still present and still have their exponents. So these are all, again, living traditions that we've been discussing. As I've said, there are many, many more things that we could talk about when we are considering Indian philosophy. It's a vast field. I invite you to read my book, but I also invite you to read the many, many, many other books that exist on this topic, to delve into any particular school or schools of thought that fascinate you. But Indian philosophy has a wide range of ideas, a wide range of arguments. And what I hope I've shown you today is the broad landscape, the overview from a great height. Now it's time to delve into the depths and get into the details of this as well. And it's something that you can make into a lifelong or maybe multiple lives long journey. Certainly, my life has been boundlessly enriched by my studies, my explorations of these traditions, intellectual explorations, studying the texts, the arguments, talking with scholars, and also on the experiential side. These traditions talk about meditative practices, contemplation. If you are a real practitioner, real sadhak, as they say in the Hindu tradition, someone who's pursuing a sadhana or spiritual path, then really the practice is everything. And the intellectual side is there as an aid, but not as an end in itself. It's part of the total way of life. But all of it is there to be explored, to be understood, and to be discovered anew by each generation that comes along. So thank you for your attention today, and I hope you got a lot out of the presentation, and that this will be the beginning of a great adventure of exploration for you.